1944, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces were being pushed back towards the German border. But Germany was about to face a new threat. In the West, Allied forces had been preparing for months to open a new front in northwest France. Training for it was well underway. But it was an attack Hitler had long been expecting. His problem was knowing when, and above all where, it would come. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of World War II, D-Day, the Allied landings along the Normandy coast of France. Since the early years of the war, Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had always been certain that at some point an Allied invasion of Northern Europe would be necessary. The only questions were when, where, and how. To test the waters, British forces had already mounted a number of practice operations. In December 1941, British commandos raided the Vargso Islands off the coast of Nazi-occupied Norway. It was an attempt to probe German defenses and tie down Hitler's troops in the north. A fish oil factory and coastal defenses were blown up before the commandos withdrew. Eight months later, Canadian and British troops were sent in to mount a more ambitious raid on the French port of Dieppe. It too was designed to test the defenses and also to provide combat experience for the Canadians. But this time, it was a catastrophe. As landing craft approached the main beach, they were met by withering fire. Those troops that made it ashore were immediately pinned down. Behind them, the supporting tanks became bogged down in the shingle. Few managed to scale the sea wall. Over 3,000 Allied soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. Britain had learnt an important lesson. Never attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Equally importantly, the Dieppe disaster reinforced the British view that an invasion of Europe could not be rushed. Churchill understood it would require careful planning. Eventually, in April 1943, at an Allied conference in Washington, Churchill and the US President Franklin Roosevelt agreed upon a date. D-Day, or Operation Overlord as the seaborne invasion of France was formally called, would take place in the summer of 1944. But by now, the Germans were preparing for it in earnest. Since the winter of 1941, they had been building an Atlantic wall. It was a massive series of fortifications running along the European coast from Denmark to the Spanish border. gun emplacements had been constructed at likely landing sites. Beaches had been mined and covered in barbed wire. Obstacles had been placed in strategic places to block landing craft. Hitler had boasted, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." In the summer of 1942, in the wake of the Dieppe attack, work on the Atlantic Wall had been stepped up. Hitler had also ordered an increase in troop numbers in the region. The German overall commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had been given 15 further divisions. But the Western European coast stretched for some 2,000 miles. He didn't have the numbers to man the entire length. Von Rundstedt faced a difficult decision. Where should he position his overstretched forces to maximize their effect? The question led to bitter arguments inside the German leadership. Von Rundstedt proposed holding a large force of panzers in reserve northwest of Paris. He could then send it in against an invasion once he knew where it was happening. But the hugely respected Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the troops covering the sector from Holland along the French coast to the Loire, had a different view. Rommel's concern was Allied air power. He'd seen it firsthand when he'd fought the British in North Africa, and it had left a profound impression. He feared that any counterattack would be broken up by Allied aircraft long before it could go into action. Rommel had also inspected Hitler's Atlantic Wall and found much of it wanting. It had forced him to the conclusion that the best place to position the panzers was as close as possible to the most likely landing sites. That way, an invasion could be immediately pushed back before it got a foothold. Hitler compromised. Rundstedt was given a small force he could hold in reserve, though Hitler himself would have the final say as to when it could be used. The rest of the additional troops was scattered along the entire Atlantic seaboard, in accordance with Rommel's wishes. It would turn out to be the worst of all the solutions. There were neither enough reserves nor enough tanks near the coast. But in the autumn of 1943, none of this was clear. In Britain, the Allied planners were also grappling with the problem of location. Where was the best place to land? Their chief planner, General Frederick Morgan, quickly realized there were two principal options: the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais was clearly the favorite. It offered the shortest sea crossing, and it offered the shortest and most direct way to Germany. But it was also the most obvious route, and Morgan was sure the Germans were expecting it. So he decided to wrong-foot them. Morgan would land in Normandy. It was the beginning of a huge gamble on which the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers would depend.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
In the autumn of 1943, Allied photo reconnaissance aircraft swept over the beaches of northern France. It was part of a huge planning operation for the seaborne invasion of Europe. The fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were monitored by the French resistance. Men crept ashore to collect sand samples to test whether armored vehicles could be landed. Northern France became the most reconnoitered coastline in the history of warfare. It soon became clear any landing would need some kind of port facilities. But the disaster at Dieppe had shown that it was too dangerous to attempt a direct assault on a German-occupied port. Britain's planners were forced to come up with an ingenious alternative. Giant hollow concrete boxes were constructed in Britain that could later be towed to the French coast. There they would be sunk to form an artificial harbour. They were known by their code name, mulberries. The mulberries would be supplied with fuel by a pipeline unwound from giant reels and dropped on the seabed. It would run for 100 miles. The pumping station on the Isle of Wight was disguised as an ice cream parlour. But the raid on Dieppe had also revealed a second problem: how to get the first wave of troops off the beaches and through the German fortifications. The man told to solve that question was General Percy Hobart, one of the pioneers of armoured warfare. Hobart came up with a series of ingenious devices. The troops called them the funnies. They included such extraordinary machines as flamethrowers and floating tanks, flail tanks for clearing mines, the bobbin for laying firm paths across sand or shingle, an armoured ramp for climbing sea walls, the fascine carrier for tackling ditches, and the bridging tank for wider obstacles. That left just one problem: how to stop the Germans rushing in overwhelming reinforcements before the Allies had established a foothold. The answer was to keep them guessing until the very last moment as to where the invasion would take place. Operation Bodyguard was a massive and complex deception campaign. German double agents in Britain now began sending back to Germany huge amounts of carefully coordinated false information. This emphasized that the main landings would be in the Pas-de-Calais, although a feint attack might be launched in Normandy. To muddy the waters still further, the Allied military created a fictitious army unit, the so-called 1st US Army Group, or FUSAG. It was stationed, very obviously, in Kent, bang opposite the Pas-de-Calais. The man in charge of it was the pistol-toting US General George Patton, who'd been removed from action in Sicily after slapping shell-shocked soldiers. Patton was rated by the Germans as the Allies' best attacking general. Just the man they expected to command the invasion of Western Europe.
Basher 5-2, this is Basher 1-1 on Alpha.
Radio transmissions mimicked the wireless traffic of an army. For the benefit of any Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying over Britain, the fields of Kent were filled with inflatable tanks and carefully faked track marks. There were dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. Harbours along the Kent coast were filled with dummy landing craft. There were even troops, though these were in reality backup units. In late 1943, the Allies appointed US General Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe. British General Bernard Montgomery would be in overall command of the initial assault troops. D-Day was fixed for June 5th, 1944. Two months before the landing, Eisenhower launched an elaborate air offensive to disrupt German links to the coast. Once again, it was carefully planned to give the impression the Allies' target was the Pas-de-Calais region. As the date of the invasion approached, Allied troop numbers in England reached over 2 million. They were supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans were well aware an invasion was imminent. But they had been completely taken in by the Allies' phony preparations in Kent and were convinced the most likely landing spot was the Pas-de-Calais. Everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. The troops were briefed. Then the weather turned against them. Rain lashed down, visibility was poor, and the channel was stormy. Nevertheless, on June 4th, 1944, the assault troops boarded their landing ships and the armada of more than 5,000 vessels set sail. But the rain continued to lash down, and later that day the invasion had to be postponed. The ships returned to port, and the assault troops faced a nerve-shredding wait. Early the next morning, the military leadership met again. The naval commanders were keen to go ahead. But the air chiefs were doubtful. They worried the visibility would still be too poor to provide effective air support. After a long silence, Eisenhower looked up. "Let's go," he said. Operation Overlord, the greatest seaborne invasion ever, was underway. D-Day had begun. At 1:15 in the morning of June the 6th, 1944, British aircraft towing gliders arrived over the coast of northern France. Then the gliders were released and plunged down to capture vital bridges over the Caen Canal in eastern Normandy. The Allies had launched their great gamble to invade Hitler's empire in Western Europe. "50 miles to the west, US paratroops came down around the village of Saint-Mère-Église. There was a fierce firefight. But 3 hours later, the village was in US hands. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was underway. An hour later, horrified German sentries along the Normandy coast saw a vast armada appear out of the mist. They had had no warning. The Allied fleet had sailed under cover of darkness. Moreover, Allied countermeasures had confused the German radar into believing the main weight of the attack was approaching the French coast further east at the Pas-de-Calais. Allied warships off the Normandy coast now began pounding the German defensive positions. Wave after wave of aircraft swept overhead. Under cover of the bombardment, assault troops headed for the shore. But as they closed in, German artillery and machine guns opened fire. A number of the landing craft were hit. Others fell foul of underwater obstructions. But at 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of troops hit the beaches. At the far western end, the US 4th Infantry Division came ashore near at what they called Utah Beach. Within 2 hours, it was linking up with the US paratroopers who'd landed at Saint-Mère-Église. Next door, at Omaha Beach, it was more difficult. The beach was a defender's dream, with high cliffs and few ways inland. As the US 1st Infantry Division waded ashore, they were mown down by German machine guns. To make matters worse, the Americans' amphibious tanks were swamped. The troops were trapped on the beach. disaster was looming. But finally, a few of the soldiers managed to scale the cliffs. Against all the odds, the Americans hung on to the beachhead. Further east, in the center of the landing area, Britain's 50th Infantry Division came ashore at Gold Beach. They too met savage fire. But now, the British deployed their funnies. The troops were soon moving inland. At the adjoining landing spot, Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced a similar situation. Here too, Britain's funnies were vital in helping the troops off the beach. Finally, on the far left flank, at Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division met only patchy resistance. Within hours, its commandos had linked up with the glider-borne troops at the Caen Canal. By early afternoon, the Allies had successfully established all of the beachheads. The timing of the invasion had caught the Germans completely by surprise. They'd expected the Allies to wait until the weather had cleared. Rommel, the operational German commander for the whole of the northwest French coast, had taken the opportunity of bad weather to visit his family in Germany. His immediate subordinate in Normandy and Brittany, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 miles away, taking part in a war game exercise. Only the overall German commander for the whole of Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was at his HQ. But he needed Hitler's permission to move his panzer reserves to the battlefield. However, Hitler was asleep, and his aides wouldn't wake him. It wasn't until midday that the Führer finally learnt about the invasion, but he didn't take it seriously. He was still convinced the main attack would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he believed, was just a feint. Finally, in the late afternoon, when the scale of the invasion was becoming all too clear, Hitler unleashed his reserves. But they were too far away to provide immediate support. Despite stubborn German resistance, the beachheads around Utah, Gold and Juno and Sword were secure. Only at Omaha was the situation more precarious. Here, German resistance had prevented the US troops moving more than a mile inland. By nightfall on June the 6th, over 100,000 Allied troops had been landed in Normandy. It had been an extraordinary feat of planning, ingenuity, and courage. The first day of the Allies' great gamble had paid off. But it was just the beginning. Now they had to build up, break out, and push on into Europe. As the second day dawned on the greatest seaborne invasion ever attempted, thousands of Allied troops had broken out of their beachheads and were moving inland. But they found the Normandy countryside hard going. The patchwork of woodland and small fields provided ideal terrain for German tanks and machine guns. The Allies suffered heavy casualties. Allied air power provided crucial support. When von Rundstedt's panzer reinforcements arrived, they'd been so depleted by the air attacks that they were unable to mount a major counterattack. The German reinforcements were also hampered by French resistance fighters, operating behind German lines. They ambushed troop convoys and blew up bridges. As a result, the Das Reich SS Panzer Division took over 2 weeks to make a journey which should have lasted a mere 3 days. Its troops took out their fury on the French civilian population. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane and its 642 inhabitants were wiped out. After 4 days of fighting, all the Allied beachheads were finally able to link up. But they'd still only managed to penetrate 10 miles inland. Eventually, 6 days after the landing, the British commander, General Montgomery, launched a major assault on the strategically important town of Caen. The British 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, advanced. But its spearhead ran into 4 German Tiger tanks. The Allies' Sherman tanks were completely outclassed. Their guns were outranged and their shells unable to penetrate the German armor. They were particularly vulnerable because many ran on petrol fuel and were liable to burst into flames when hit. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, or more macabrely, the Tommy Cooker. In less than 5 minutes, more than 10 British tanks were destroyed. The attack on Caen stalled. Outmatched by the German tanks, the Allies relied on air power and artillery. But it wasn't enough. The Desert Rats retreated. Caen remained in German hands. Meanwhile, further west, US forces advanced on the equally important port of Cherbourg. It would take them nearly 10 days to get close to it. They weren't helped by the weather. During the first week of the invasion, it had been relatively calm, and supplies and reinforcements had poured in through the Mulberry artificial harbours. But now the weather turned. Gales swept the English Channel. The US Mulberry Harbour at Omaha was destroyed. The other Mulberry, in the British sector, was badly damaged and put out of action for several days. The flow of reinforcements slowed. It meant the port of Cherbourg was an even more vital objective. As the US forces now approached it, the German garrison resisted. There was fierce house-to-house fighting. It would take the Allies a week to secure the city. But the port had been trashed by the fleeing Germans. It would take a further month before it could be brought back into service. Meanwhile, Montgomery launched another assault on Caen. But the storms had turned the fields into a sea of mud. Low cloud meant air support was impossible. To make matters worse, the newly arrived elite German 2nd SS Panzer Corps was thrown into the defense of the city. After 4 days, the British were again forced to halt. Then, as the clouds cleared, nearly 500 Allied bombers devastated Caen. British troops fought their way into the north suburbs. But the ruins made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. Allied casualties mounted. After 48 hours, the attack was, yet again, called off. Three weeks later, Montgomery tried for a fourth time. The plan was to capture the remaining German strongholds and then push on south, deeper into France. After 2 more days of fighting, the city was finally won. The way now seemed open for the British tanks to move south, deeper into France. But the Germans were waiting with a large force of panzers. The British advance stopped again. The Americans in the west, however, were having an easier time. The fighting around Caen had sucked in the majority of the German defenders. As the American forces prepared to thrust further into France, they faced only scattered opposition. The scene was set for the Allied forces to break out at last. At 9:30 in the morning of July the 25th, 1944, over 1,800 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a 4-mile stretch of the German front line south of Cherbourg. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the US breakout into France. The German defenders were stunned by the size of the assault. But so too were some of the US soldiers. The plan had been for the bombers to fly in from the east, parallel to the US front line, to minimize the risk of bombing American troops. But most of the aircraft came in over the top of the US lines. Bombs fell short. Over 100 US troops were hit and killed. Yet despite the ferocity of the bombardment, when the US forces later picked themselves up and moved forward, they found to their astonishment substantial numbers of German troops had survived. The survivors mounted a stubborn resistance. As fighting raged, it looked as though the Americans would fail to break through the German lines. But then, the German defenses crumbled. The next morning, US tanks broke through and moved forward into open country. There was now almost no German resistance left, and the Americans quickly pushed deeper into France. The hill town of Coutances fell. Then the crossroads town of Avranches. As the Allies pressed forward, they were helped by change and confusion in the German high command. At the beginning of July, 3 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler dismissed the German commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for defeatism. Von Rundstedt had made little attempt to hide his belief that Germany faced an unwinnable struggle. He was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, fresh from the Eastern Front, but with little knowledge of northwestern France. Two weeks later, Rommel, the second most senior German officer on the front, was severely injured when his staff car was strafed by a British fighter. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On July the 20th, 1944, a disillusioned aristocratic war hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in the planning hut at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Four officers were killed. But Hitler was sheltered by a heavy, solid oak conference table and escaped with only minor injuries. The plot was swiftly and brutally put down. Von Stauffenberg was shot, and his principal collaborators put on trial. They would later be hanged. Hitler put a brave face on it and visited some of the wounded in hospital. But it hardened still further his distrust of his senior officers. He would, despite his many earlier misjudgments, demand even greater control over events on the battlefield. Back in France, General George Patton, back in charge of a real fighting force, ordered his troops to fan out. They took Rennes, Mayenne, and headed for Le Mans. They were now moving round behind the German forces, still battling it out with the British and Canadians near Caen. With the Americans to their south and the British to their north, it seemed the German forces in Normandy would be surrounded. Hitler issued his usual order that there should be no retreat, but as the Allies squeezed in on them, the Germans began to flee. They were remorselessly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery. The casualties were appalling. Finally, on August the 20th, 1944, the Allied forces moving in from both the north and south met up. The so-called Falaise Gap, named after the nearby French village, had been closed. Large numbers of Germans were trapped. Over 10,000 more Germans, caught in the Allied pincer, died. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German army in Western Europe was in chaos. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the French Mediterranean coast near Cannes, there was a second Allied seaborne invasion. US troops came ashore virtually unopposed. They were helped by paratroopers from the Free French Army, men who had escaped from German-occupied French territory in Europe and North Africa. The landing had always been opposed by the British, who regarded it as a diversion. But the United States had long regarded it as an essential part of clearing the Germans out of France. The troops were greeted by an ecstatic civilian population. It was soon advancing rapidly up the Rhone Valley. Lyon was liberated on September the 3rd, 1944. Ten days later, they reached Dijon and made contact with Patton's forces advancing from western France. German units stationed across the region fled. In barely 3 weeks of headlong advance, the Allied invasion of Europe had liberated most of France. That left Paris, where French resistance fighters now rose up against the German occupation. There seemed little to prevent the Allied onrush from continuing to the German border. By early 1945, Hitler's Third Reich was entering its death throes. In the west, Allied forces had pushed to within striking distance of the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was crossing the Polish border into Germany. As the Allies battled their way towards Berlin from east and west, the Germans fought them all the way. But it was a hopeless task. By May 1945, Hitler would be dead, and Germany finally defeated. February 1945, and the Allied forces in the west had assembled near the Rhine for the final push into Germany. In the north were the massed ranks of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. To its south was General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. It included the U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George Patton. On February the 8th, Montgomery's Army Group launched a two-pronged assault on German forces defending the Rhine. The northern prong had to fight its way through the wooded countryside. The southern prong was delayed when the Germans released water from a series of dams, flooding the surrounding area. It would be over 2 weeks before the two prongs met up on the west bank of the Rhine. By early March 1945, Montgomery's forces were in control of some 60 miles of the west bank of the river. The next task was to cross it. South of Montgomery, Bradley's armies were also moving eastwards, looking for a route across the river. On March the 7th, 1945, they reached the Rhine at Cologne. But Hitler had ordered all the bridges to be destroyed. Then, as the US forces explored further south, they found one bridge still intact near the small town of Remagen. They made a dash for it, brushing aside German resistance. Then, just as they were about to cross it, there was an explosion. But against the odds, the bridge remained standing. A small group of Americans raced across it, desperately cutting any wires that looked like demolition cables. US commanders began to push men across as fast as possible. The Allies had at last penetrated the German heartland. In Berlin, news of the capture of the bridge at Remagen infuriated Hitler. 5 junior officers were court-martialed. 4 were shot. In addition, the long-suffering German commander in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was sacked. It was the second time it had happened to him in less than a year. He was replaced by veteran commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who'd been in overall charge in North Africa and Italy. Over the next week, the Germans launched desperate air attacks to try and destroy the bridge at Remagen. None of them succeeded. Then, suddenly, on March the 17th, while combat engineers were repairing it, the bridge unexpectedly collapsed. 28 men plunged to their deaths. The first Allied thrust into Germany had been blocked. Meanwhile, further north, Montgomery was preparing the first full-scale Allied crossing of the Rhine. On March the 23rd, 1945, he launched an aerial bombardment on German forces defending the east bank of the river. Some 200 RAF Lancaster bombers virtually flattened the town of Wesel. Then British commandos in Buffalo amphibious vehicles crossed. They met little opposition from the dazed German defenders. Other divisions followed. The crossing lasted all night. The following day, in the largest airborne operation of the war, 17,000 men of British 6th and US 17th Airborne Divisions were dropped to seize key positions east of the river. They were met by heavy German anti-aircraft fire. A newsreel report told the story.
In a short time, hundreds of gliders make their hazardous landings, their men beginning the fight as soon as they land. One glider has its wing shot away when only 50 feet from the ground.
More than half the gliders were destroyed or damaged before landing. But within hours, the paratroopers linked up with Montgomery's land forces and the Allied bridgehead was secured. It should have been, for the ferociously competitive Montgomery, a moment of glory. But he'd been upstaged. The night before, his great rival, General Patton, had unexpectedly crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim and had already entered Germany. It was a sign of the intense rivalry between Montgomery and American commanders as they competed to be the first into Germany. Over the next few days, there were more Allied crossings. German defenses along the Rhine collapsed. In the north, Montgomery now pushed deeper into Germany, towards Munster. In the south, Bradley's forces, including Patton's Third Army, pushed east towards Marburg and Lauterbach. The major German city of Frankfurt am Main was circled and bypassed. Die-hard German troops fought back ferociously. But by now there was no question that the Germans were finished. The only issue was when they would realize it. As the Western Allies battled their way across West Germany, Stalin's Red Army in Poland prepared to launch a major offensive on Germany's eastern border. Hitler's forces in the region were poorly equipped and ill-prepared to repel an attack. The supplies of weapons had run so low, they were reduced to using First World War rifles. German intelligence estimated the Red Army's infantry outnumbered them 11-1. The Russians also had vastly more tanks and artillery. But the Germans had nothing left. Hitler's strategic reserve had already been used up on the Western Front. On January the 12th, 1945, the Russian offensive began with the usual artillery barrage. It stretched along a 300-mile front. A week later, the Red Army drove into the devastated remains of Warsaw. They then pushed westwards towards the German border, 300 miles away. To the south, a second Soviet force took the Polish town of Krakow on January the 18th. As the Soviet forces now raced westwards on a broad front across Poland, they left behind pockets of German resistance in cities like Poznan and Breslau. These would later be mopped up. By the end of January 1945, Soviet troops had crossed the German border and reached the river Oder. The Russians were now just an hour's drive east of Berlin. For the veteran Russian commander Georgy Zhukov, it had been a triumph. He had traveled 300 miles in just 14 days. It was one of the fastest and longest blitzkrieg advances in military history. Zhukov's troops now paused to catch their breath and bring up supplies. They were soon joined by a second group of Soviet armies that dug in to their south on the river Neisse. Meanwhile, a third Russian force penned the remnants of the German armies in East Prussia into the Baltic port of Königsberg, Kaliningrad today. Hitler had appointed the SS chief Heinrich Himmler to command his forces in the neighboring region. It was a sign of how deeply he had come to distrust his army generals. But Himmler had no military knowledge or experience. During February 1945, troops under Himmler's command were torn apart by Russian forces moving west. This time Hitler could have sent reserves. A large force of German troops still occupied the Courland Peninsula in neighboring Latvia. But in another bizarre decision, Hitler refused to allow it to break out and provide assistance. He was still committed to holding on to land, his Lebensraum, however irrelevant or wasteful it might now be. It meant some 200,000 German troops spent the final months of the war doing nothing. The Red Army now prepared for its final assault on Berlin. It lay less than 50 miles away. In Germany, the imminent Soviet invasion caused mass panic among the civilian population. The Russians had seen firsthand the horrors perpetrated by the Germans in the Soviet Union. They'd witnessed whole towns and villages destroyed, their inhabitants massacred. They were now very clearly looking for revenge. There were horrific tales of Russian rape, murder, and pillage. In snow and bitter sub-zero temperatures, more than 5 million German civilians on the Eastern Front fled their homes and flooded west to seek refuge. 2 million people were evacuated by sea from German-held ports along the Baltic coast. They were easy pickings for Soviet submarines. "24 German passenger ships were torpedoed. They included the cruise liner Wilhelm Gustloff, which had over 10,000 people on board. Barely 1,000 survived, the worst loss of life ever in a single incident at sea. Hitler's acting Chief of Staff, General Heinz Guderian, now urged the Führer to bring back any units that could be spared from the Western Front to defend Berlin. Hitler agreed and brought back the elite 6th SS Panzer Army. But he didn't send it to Berlin. He sent it to Hungary. He had become obsessed with defending Germany's last remaining source of oil, the Hungarian oil field west of Lake Balaton. It was an ill-considered decision. In Hungary, the panzers were hopelessly outnumbered by the Russians. make matters worse, the weather conspired against them. A sudden thaw turned the ground into a sea of mud. For several days, the panzers struggled to hold back the advancing Russians. But they were steadily forced back into Austria. Soon they were drawn into the defense of Vienna as the Red Army advanced towards the Austrian capital. But 6th SS Panzer Army was a spent force. Its commander, SS General Sepp Dietrich, had no illusions. "We call ourselves," he said, "the 6th Panzer Army because we have only 6 panzers left." On April the 10th, the Red Army swept them aside and took Vienna. As they did so, the question now became, who would be the first to reach Berlin? Would it be the Red Army or the Western Allies? The race for Berlin had become not just a military, but a political issue. By March 1945, the Red Army was lined up along the River Oder, awaiting a final assault on Berlin. It presented the Allied military command in the West with a dilemma. Berlin was less than 300 miles from their advanced positions. Most Allied commanders wanted to race to the city to beat the Russians. But at a conference a month earlier in the Black Sea port of Yalta, the Allied leaders had divided up Germany into zones of influence. Berlin was firmly inside the Russian zone. So Eisenhower was instructed to tell his commanders to ignore Berlin and spread out to take the rest of the country. On April the 1st, US troops surrounded the German industrial cities in the Ruhr. German soldiers occupying the area put up a stiff resistance. When, 2 weeks later, the area fell, more than 325,000 troops were taken prisoner. It was one of the largest number of German prisoners taken in the war so far. The German commander, the die-hard Nazi Field Marshal Walter Model, committed suicide. Elsewhere in the country, resistance was more patchy, and General Bradley's armies stormed across Germany. By April the 18th, 1945, the US forces had punched a corridor through to the Czech border, splitting Germany in two. Meanwhile, north of the Ruhr, Montgomery's Canadian First Army began the liberation of Holland. The Dutch had suffered horrendously during the bitter winter of 1944-1945. The German occupying force had deliberately taken supplies of food and fuel from the country to use elsewhere. There had been widespread deaths from starvation and cold. The Dutch town of Arnhem was seized on April the 15th, 1945. Progress was rapid, and on the following day the Canadians had liberated Groningen, close to the Dutch north coast. That left a German army virtually intact, but surrounded near Amsterdam. Soon afterwards, a ceasefire was negotiated. Allied aircraft now roared over the Dutch countryside, dropping food and medical supplies. At the same time, the British Second Army, also under Montgomery's command, pushed fast across the North German plain. Osnabrück fell on April the 4th. The British were soon at the German port of Bremen. Here there was fierce German resistance. It took 9 days of house-to-house fighting before the port was secured. Two days later, Montgomery's British forces reached the Elbe at Lauenburg. As the Allies advanced across Germany, they now came across horrific new evidence of the Nazis' final solution. In early April 1945, US troops overran a concentration camp at Ohrdruf, near Weimar, in central Germany. A visibly shocked General Eisenhower paid a visit. The SS had evacuated most of the prisoners, but they had left behind piles of bodies. Eight days later, British troops overran another concentration camp at Belsen, north of Hanover. Here they discovered over 70,000 prisoners. Thousands were already dead. The remainder were starving and disease-ridden. A radio broadcast by the BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby gave the horrific details.
I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. It was as though they were waiting their turn. This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly.
Meanwhile, far to the south, in Italy, the German front was also starting to collapse. The German forces were dug in across the Apennine Mountains. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, now launched a spring offensive. On April the 9th, 1945, British troops attacked, pulling German forces in from along the front. Five days later, US troops also moved forward and swiftly reached the south bank of the River Po. The Germans retreated to the north bank. But Hitler's commander in Italy, General Heinrich von Wiettinghoff, had no illusions that he could hold back the Allied advance for long. So he now made approaches to the Allies, and on April the 29th surrendered unconditionally. It would take effect from May the 2nd, 1945. This was the first formal surrender of German forces anywhere in Europe. The war was moving swiftly towards a conclusion. Back in Germany, American and Russian forces had by now met up on the Elbe near Leipzig.
The moment the world has been awaiting so long, when Alive from West meets Alive from East. The meeting was achieved on April 26, when a detachment of the American 69th Infantry Division, under Major General Reinhardt, was rowed across the Elbe to the Russians assembled on the far bank.
The stage was set for the final assault on Berlin. Hitler was desperate. He now turned to the old and very young for help in defending the city. His 1,000-year Reich was preparing for its final, apocalyptic struggle to survive. On April the 1st, 1945, Joseph Stalin summoned his top commanders to Moscow to receive their orders for the capture of Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Russia's most successful commander, would make the main assault from his bridgehead on the Oder River. A second group of Soviet armies, under Marshal Ivan Konev, would cross the river Neisse further south and push deep into Germany, bypassing the German capital. Between them, they represented a massive Soviet force of over 2.5 million men. They were equipped with 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. But the Germans were never going to make it easy. The city was defended by about 1 million troops. Many were dug into strong defensive positions, particularly along the Silo Heights, a steep escarpment rising out of the Oder Valley and slap in front of Zhukov's point of assault. The defenders were a mixed bunch of combat veterans, SS fanatics, and inexperienced conscripts, some as young as 14, as well as elderly members of the Volkssturm, or People's Army. By now, Hitler had retired to a bunker under the Reichschancellery in Berlin. He was a heavily medicated and shambling figure who spent much of his time issuing increasingly unrealistic orders to largely imaginary armies. His public appearances were becoming ever more rare. But in early March, he was persuaded to visit some of the troops preparing to defend the Oder Line. Later in the same month, he emerged to inspect a small group of Hitler Youth soldiers. It was his last ever appearance before the cameras. Then, on April the 13th, 1945, the US President, Franklin Roosevelt, died of a heart attack. He had been one of the architects of the war, responsible for throwing America's might behind the Allied offensive. The Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, seized on the event to encourage his increasingly befuddled Führer to believe the Allied alliance would collapse. A German victory could still be snatched from the jaws of defeat. But any illusions were rapidly dispelled. 3 days after Roosevelt's death, Zhukov began his assault on Berlin. He had one gun for every 13 feet of the front. But the German defense had anticipated it and pulled back to avoid the bombardment. As a result, when Zhukov's infantry advanced, they met unexpectedly heavy resistance. Desperate to retrieve the situation, Zhukov threw in his tanks. But they too were soon bogged down. Meanwhile, to the south, the assault by Konyev's second group of armies had gone better. His troops had crossed the Neisse River and were well on their way to the next obstacle, the River Spree. Stalin stoked the rivalry between his two commanders by authorizing Konyev to swing his tanks north towards Berlin. He was only too happy to see a race to take the city. After 3 days of savage fighting, Zhukov's troops managed to enter the eastern suburbs of Berlin. At the same time, Konyev was approaching the city from the south. There was desperate German resistance. But on April the 25th, the Soviet armies met up and the final assault on Berlin began. As the fighting moved on from district to district, civilians began to emerge from the cellars. But the Russians took little notice of the flags of surrender. The rape of German women and girls was widespread. After 3 more days of fighting, the city's remaining defenders were pinned down in a narrow strip of central Berlin less than 2 miles wide. Every street and house was contested. Then, on the morning of April the 30th, Soviet troops began an assault on the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Stalin regarded it as the symbol of Nazi power. They were stopped by heavy fire. So they blasted the building at point-blank range with heavy artillery. That evening, the Russians stormed it. Fighting raged from room to room and up and down corridors and staircases. It would take 4 hours before the red flag could be hoisted on one of the towers. The next morning, on May the 1st, 1945, the event was restaged for the cameras. But by then, Hitler was already dead. On April the 30th, as fighting raged overhead, the man whose insane ambitions had embroiled the world in war, laid waste a continent, and led to the extermination of millions of Jews, took his own life.
Zweitens, Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos...
His longtime mistress, Eva Braun, who he'd married the day before, died with him. Their partially burned bodies were buried in the garden of the Reichschancellery. But the fighting continued. Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz his successor, and for the next few days the new leadership attempted to salvage something from its nation's cataclysmic defeat. On May the 1st, 1945, the day after his death, German people were told that their Führer had fallen in battle. But they were told to continue the fight against the Bolshevik menace. But the German leadership was falling apart. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann tried to negotiate a city-wide ceasefire with the Russians. But the Russian commander, Marshal Zhukov, demanded unconditional surrender of all German forces everywhere. It was more than Goebbels and Bormann could deliver. Fighting in Berlin continued. Later that evening, Goebbels and his wife killed their 6 children and then committed suicide themselves. That same night, Bormann disappeared. Eventually, in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed that a body found in Berlin was his. The next morning, Berlin surrendered. By mid-afternoon, all fighting in the city had stopped. Across the country, the pace of the German surrender now gathered momentum. The following day, Dönitz sent a delegation to the British commanding officer, Field Marshal Montgomery. He offered to surrender all German forces in northern Germany. Montgomery sent a reply saying he didn't have the authority to accept a surrender on behalf of the Americans or the Russians. He could only accept the surrender of those troops fighting him. Dönitz had no choice but to agree to Montgomery's terms. But that left Germany still fighting in the rest of the country. Dönitz now sent another delegation to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, to discuss a peace deal with the West, but it carefully avoided any reference to a surrender to the Russians. Eisenhower rebuffed him and insisted that only the unconditional surrender of all German forces was acceptable. Once again, Dönitz was forced to back down. At 2:41 in the morning of May the 7th, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in France, General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the 6 years of war, signed a document of unconditional surrender. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, signed for the Western Allies. General Ivan Suslopurov signed for the Soviet Union. The only member of the Allies' side not happy with the arrangement was Stalin. The Soviet Union had suffered too much to miss out on its own humiliation of the Germans. So Stalin countermanded Suslopurov and declared Russia would only accept a surrender in Berlin. It meant that the following day, Hitler's former chief of staff, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signed a second surrender document to satisfy Stalin. Marshal Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union, with Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signing on behalf of the Western Allies.
In January 1943, the late President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met in Casablanca. There they pronounced the formula of unconditional surrender for the Axis powers. In Europe, that formula has now been fulfilled.
Across Europe and the United States, crowds began to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. From now on, the day after the German surrender, May the 8th, would be known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. But as the celebrations continued, many were aware of two very sobering issues. In the East, Japan was still fighting. And in Europe, the continent lay in ruins, and huge problems needed to be solved. Millions of Germany's concentration camp victims and slave laborers would need help to rebuild their lives. Millions of captured German fighting men had to be screened before being allowed to go home to identify and arrest major war criminals. The SS was a particular target. It had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. Leading Nazis like Hermann Goering, head of Hitler's Air Force, were rounded up and paraded in front of the cameras. Other top Nazis arrested included civilian leaders like Albert Speer and military leaders like Jodl and Dönitz. They would be put on trial in the German city of Nuremberg for crimes against humanity.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess, You must plead guilty or not guilty. That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
The Nazi leadership received sentences ranging from the death penalty to 10 years in prison. Goering committed suicide before he could be hung. Two months after the German surrender, the Allies met in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, British, American, and French. Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was parceled up between the Allies in the same way. The peoples of Europe would also find themselves divided. Some would now live under the control of the Western Allies, some under Communist Russia. But before any of this could be faced, there was still the war in the Pacific to be won. In the first months of 1945, Japan was on the run. The Americans had fought their way across the Pacific. US submarines and aircraft had destroyed Japan's merchant fleet and naval air power. The main Japanese home islands had been cut off from vital supplies of fuel and raw materials. The Japanese were facing defeat. Yet they refused to surrender, convinced that if they fought back with sufficient brutality, the Americans wouldn't have the stomach for the fight and would give in. Japan made clear that every move towards the home islands would be paid for in Allied blood. It presented the United States with a huge problem. How could Japan be defeated without a terrible loss of American life? The country would eventually turn to the most powerful and dreadful weapon ever seen. A weapon that would change the course of war forever. In early 1945, as US military planners considered the next move against Japan, their gaze fell on the Japanese-occupied island of Iwo Jima. It lay a mere 800 miles from the Japanese mainland and would be a valuable base for attacking the country. the US commander in the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, assembled the largest landing fleet ever brought together in the Pacific campaign and prepared to invade the island. Nimitz was taking no risks. Wave after wave of American aircraft paved the way with a massive aerial bombardment. Then, on the morning of February the 19th, 1945, the guns of the Naval Task Force began one of the most prolonged bombardments of the war. At the same time, landing craft set off for the shore. The Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima along the southwestern shore just after 9 o'clock in the morning. For a few moments there was an eerie calm. The massive naval and aerial bombardment appeared to have overwhelmed the Japanese garrison. Then a hurricane of Japanese fire swept over them. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on the island, had told his men to hold their fire until the Americans were right under their guns. Now the Japanese opened up from a network of tunnels, caves, and bunkers. There was carnage. But gradually, small groups of US troops inched their way forward. Finally, by the evening, the beachhead had been secured. The task now was to capture the 550-foot-high Mount Suribachi, the heavily defended volcano that dominates Iwo Jima. For 3 days, Marines clawed their way up the steep, pitted slopes. They were supported by a constant air and naval bombardment from the invasion fleet. Finally, on February the 23rd, 1945, a US platoon led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier began the final assault, carrying with them a small US flag. They reached the summit and raised their flag using a piece of piping as a pole. Marine Corps photographer Staff Sergeant Louis Lowery captured the scene with a few precious photographs. The hard-pressed Marines on the beaches below cheered and wept. Ships sounded their whistles. Three hours later, the event was restaged with a larger US flag. The moment was immortalized by photographer Joe Rosenthal with one of the most iconic photographs of the war. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. The rest of the island was still in Japanese hands. The next day, the Marines captured the first of the island's strategically vital airfields. But Kuribayashi had told his men to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Their duty to the Emperor to die on the island. It meant each assault became a bloody frontal affair. It took 2 weeks before the remaining 2 airfields on the island were in US hands. Even as the fighting continued, the US Air Force began to make use of Iwo Jima's airfields. During the late spring and summer of 1945, over 2,500 damaged US bombers made emergency landings on the island, often saving the lives of their crews. Finally, at the end of March, after some 6 weeks of ferocious fighting, the last Japanese resistance was snuffed out. But the capture of Iwo Jima had come at a terrible price. Only 200 of the 22,000-strong Japanese garrison survived. The Americans had also suffered badly. Nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed and some 18,000 wounded. The Americans finally had the base they needed, but it was now clear that unless the US could come up with an alternative, any invasion of Japan would be paid for in tens of thousands of American lives. In the United States, one group of military planners had long believed there was an alternative to invading Japan. It was called strategic bombing. This involved carefully targeted bombing raids designed to destroy Japan's infrastructure, industry, and ability to wage war. But in the first years of the Pacific War, there was a problem. Japan lay beyond the range of America's bombers. In April 1942, the US had managed to launch a one-off bombing raid on Tokyo. But it had pushed the bombers to their limits and was never a practical long-term option. Then, in early 1944, the Boeing Aircraft Corporation produced a revolutionary new heavy bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. It could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over a range of 3,250 miles. Suddenly, Japan was just about in reach of America's forward bases in the Pacific. In summer 1944, 9 months before the assault on Iwo Jima, US B-29 stationed at Chengdu in southwest China began a series of strategic bombing raids on Japan. But range was still an issue. It was too far for a fighter escort, so the superfortresses had to fly alone, staying at high altitude for their own safety. Even then, the range was only just within limits, and there was no room for navigational error. many of the bombs missed their targets. Then in July 1944, there was a development that gave strategic bombing a new lease of life. The US Navy captured the Mariana Islands in the Central Pacific. They were only 1,500 miles from the Japanese homeland. This was well within the B-29's operating range. The odds for a successful bombing campaign on Japan had dramatically improved. On November the 24th, over 100 super fortresses took off from the Marianas. Their target? The Nakajima aircraft factory in Tokyo. But only 48 bombs struck anywhere near the target. For 3 months, more raids targeted other industrial sites. But the B-29s were still flying without a fighter escort and still dropping their bombs from high altitude. The targets were often obscured by cloud, and jet stream winds made accurate bomb aiming impossible. To make matters worse, the B-29 suffered from engine problems. There were also attacks from kamikaze pilots. By the winter of 1944, it was clear that strategic bombing was just not working. If Japan was to be bombed into submission, the US would have to come up with something else. So it was that on December the 18th, 1944, America tried a new tactic. 84 B-29s set off from Chengdu for Japanese-occupied Hankow on the Yangtze River. They flew much lower than usual and carried mostly incendiary rather than high-explosive bombs. Hankow was devastated. The raid was more effective than almost any of the previous strategic bombing raids. The US appeared to have found a way forward: firebombing at low altitude. The US bomber commander in the Marianas, General Curtis LeMay, now ordered the systematic firebombing of Japan. It was the same tactic that Britain had employed in Germany. On the evening of March the 9th, 1945, Pathfinder aircraft roared over Tokyo, dropping incendiary target indicators. The fires they started marked the aiming points for almost 300 B-29s. Coming in at just 5,000 feet, they dropped over 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs. The flimsy wooden houses stood no chance. Air was sucked in, creating towering firestorms which raced faster than people could run. The glow from the burning city could be seen over 150 miles away. When the all clear finally sounded the following morning, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been obliterated. Over 100,000 of its citizens were killed and 1 million made homeless. Tokyo was not the only city to face this devastating new tactic. Nagoya was set ablaze 2 nights later. Then Osaka and Kobe during the following week. Firestorms engulfed whole areas, destroying houses and industrial facilities. But American success was coming at a price. Without escorts, the low-flying US bombers were dangerously vulnerable to Japanese fighters. American losses now mounted. If the bombing campaign was ever to succeed, the US needed bases even closer to Japan. Within weeks, Iwo Jima fell. Now, at last, the US Air Force not only had a base for its bombers within easy striking distance of Japan, it could finally use its Mustang fighters to escort them. During the late spring and early summer of 1945, strikes of up to 500 bombers attacked Japan every other day. Once the largest industrial areas had been crippled, LeMay moved on to lesser targets. Yet, in the face of catastrophic damage and an appalling death toll, the Japanese showed no sign of cracking. It finally dawned on the Americans that strategic bombing alone was never going to defeat Japan. It looked like a full-scale invasion of the country was becoming inevitable. For the US battle planners, the next logical step in the land campaign was the Japanese island of Okinawa. It lay a mere 350 miles from the Japanese homeland islands. The island was defended by more than 120,000 men. The Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ishijima, was determined to turn it into an American graveyard. Once again, Admiral Nimitz, the US commander in the region, assembled a huge fleet. It included 40 aircraft carriers and 18 battleships. The opening bombardment of Okinawa began on March the 23rd, 1945. It lasted for a whole week. Finally, on the morning of April the 1st, the assault boats headed for the shore. To their surprise, they met almost no opposition. By nightfall, 60,000 men had landed, and the beachhead was up to 2 miles deep. For the next 2 days, the US forces built up their strength and pushed across the island. Again, opposition was unexpectedly light. By April the 4th, the Japanese defenders had been split in two. Marine divisions now headed north, Army units pushed south. The Marines continued to meet only sporadic resistance, and within 3 weeks had cleared the northern part of the island. But it was a different story in the south. There, the Army units ran into savage fire. For 10 days, the Japanese held their defensive line. Then, when they could hold out no longer, they simply withdrew to the next defensive position and continued to resist all over again. Meanwhile, the Japanese also prepared to launch an air assault on the invasion fleet. Early on the morning of April the 7th, kamikaze pilots gathered to drink their ritual cups of sake and climb into their aircraft for the last time. Over 700 aircraft, half of them kamikazes, took off and approached the US landing fleet. A line of radar-equipped destroyers, operating about 50 miles out at sea, was hit first. By the end of the first day of the attack, 2 US destroyers had been sunk. "24 other vessels were also damaged. But the Japanese had lost over 300 planes. Over the following days, the Japanese introduced a new weapon. The Oka, or cherry blossom, was a rocket-powered suicide missile driven by a kamikaze pilot. It was launched from a bomber and carried a massive 2,650-pound warhead. On April the 12th, another US destroyer was hit and sunk. The Oka looked deadly, but US fighters quickly learned to intercept and shoot down the bombers that carried them. In desperation, the Japanese Navy now sent a suicide mission of its own. The Yamato, Japan's largest battleship, was loaded with just enough fuel to reach Okinawa and ordered to fight to the death, sinking as many US ships as possible in the process. But as the giant ship approached Okinawa, it was spotted. Some 400 US aircraft descended on it. Within 2 hours, it blew up. The fireball could be seen for over 100 miles. Back on Okinawa, torrential rain now turned the battlefield into a quagmire. For over a month, US troops struggled to push their way south. Every cave or dugout entrance had to be blasted by flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives. As before, as one defensive line was overrun, the Japanese slipped back to another, and the whole grim business would start again. US casualties rapidly mounted. Finally, on June the 1st, the town of Shuri was captured. Then, on June the 4th, a new contingent of Marines landed to the south of Naha, the island's capital, and linked up with troops pushing down from the north. Savage fighting continued, but by June the 17th, the Japanese resistance was collapsing. Five days later, the Americans finally secured Okinawa. The Japanese commander, General Ishijima, committed ritual suicide, harakiri. Over 7,000 prisoners were taken, the first time ever that such large numbers of Japanese troops had surrendered. It had been a bloody and exhausting campaign. 100,000 Japanese soldiers and some 40,000 civilians had been killed. The Americans, for their part, had lost over 15,000 men. It was a sobering reminder of what would await the American forces if they invaded the main Japanese home islands. More than ever, they needed a solution. A way to obliterate Japan's will to fight, once and for all. The victory at Okinawa meant America's military planners now had to decide what to do next. Despite shattering defeats, the Japanese still showed no sign of surrendering. Some US commanders argued for a continuation of the firebombing campaign. But by the summer of 1945, it was clear that bombing alone would never defeat Japan. An invasion seemed unavoidable. But the question was, at what price? The Japanese had some 1 million men defending the home islands. They were supported by about 5,000 aircraft, and new kamikaze pilots were being trained all the time. Mass suicide attacks by civilian volunteers could also be expected. A bloodbath seemed inevitable. It was estimated that over 250,000 American lives might be lost. Then, in July 1945, the new US President, Harry S. Truman, heard about the results of a top-secret Allied scientific research program. It was called the Manhattan Project. For 3 years, Allied scientists had been working on an atom bomb, a weapon that draws on the vast quantities of energy released when an atom is split. It would have an unimaginable destructive force. The project was led by US General Leslie Groves, an Army engineer. The scientific director was Robert Oppenheimer, a 39-year-old physicist from the University of California. Over a 3-year period, the program had recruited many of the Allies' best scientific brains. 2 radioactive materials seemed to offer most promise as fuels for the new bombs. One was a naturally occurring form of uranium called uranium-235. It was processed at a vast factory at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The other was plutonium, a man-made material manufactured in primitive nuclear reactors at Hanford in Washington state. The research was coordinated and conducted by a team of scientists at Los Alamos, a specially built laboratory complex in the New Mexico desert. By early 1945, the Los Alamos scientists were pretty confident that they had a uranium bomb that worked. But it required huge quantities of uranium-235, and the scientists worried that they didn't have enough of it. So they also designed a second bomb that used plutonium. But this, unlike the uranium bomb, was much less well understood, and they weren't sure it would work. Before it could be used, they would need to test it. By early July 1945, after an expenditure of more than $2 billion, the plutonium bomb was ready for trials. The gadget, as it was called, was mounted on a steel tower in the New Mexico desert. At 5:30 in the morning of July the 16th, the atomic age began. News that Operation Trinity had been successful was swiftly passed to President Truman. He had recently arrived at a conference in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam, meeting with Stalin and Churchill, discussing the future of Europe. Truman didn't hesitate. He ordered his commanders to prepare to drop the new bombs on Japan as soon as possible. Two bombs, a uranium device codenamed Little Boy and a plutonium bomb called Fat Man, were now transported to the Mariana Islands. There, the immensely experienced Colonel Paul Tibbets, leader of the specially trained 509th Composite Group, prepared his B-29. At 2:45 in the morning of August the 6th, Tibbets lifted his plane, named Enola Gay after his mother, off the runway. On board, he was carrying Little Boy. The flight to the target, Japan's fourth largest city, Hiroshima, went without a hitch. At 8 a.m. on a bright sunny morning, Enola Gay approached the city at 33,000 feet. Then, at just after 8:15, Little Boy was released. The uranium bomb had the power of nearly 13,000 tons of TNT. The temperature beneath the mushroom cloud reached 5,000 degrees centigrade. Thousands of people were instantly vaporized. Shock waves leveled buildings up to a 5-mile radius. Estimates of the death toll vary hugely. Some put it at 40,000 people, others at 100,000. Many suffered from terrible burns and blistering. Over the course of the following weeks, thousands more people died from radiation poisoning. On August the 7th, 1945, President Truman told the world about the bomb and issued Japan with a warning.
Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. They may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
But no Japanese surrender was received. 2 days later, on August the 9th, Fat Man was dropped on the major military port of Nagasaki. The plutonium bomb was even more powerful. In fact, the bomb fell way off target, but it still caused massive destruction. Between 35,000 and 50,000 people are estimated to have died in the explosion. The Japanese government could now have no doubt that they faced a new and horrific weapon. But the question remained, would even this force them to surrender? The Nagasaki bomb was followed by a stark warning from US Secretary of State James Burns.
There is still time, but little time, for the Japanese to save themselves from the destruction which threatens them.
The intention was clear. The atom bomb would be used again and again until Japan gave in. That same day, Japan's position became even more precarious. Early in the morning of August the 9th, 1.5 million Soviet troops stormed into Manchuria and northern China. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was not only after territory, he wanted a say in any final peace settlement in the Far East. There were still over 1 million Japanese troops in the area, but the Red Army blitzkrieg was unstoppable. The Japanese position in the war had become untenable. That evening, Emperor Hirohito met with his 6 top military and political leaders. The war cabinet was divided. 3, led by the Prime Minister, Baron Kantaro Suzuki, argued for peace. The other 3 wanted to continue fighting. It was deadlock. Then the Japanese Prime Minister broke with all precedent and asked the Emperor for his opinion. Emperor Hirohito voted for peace, on condition that his position as head of state was maintained. The next morning, a proposal was sent to the US Secretary of State, James Burns. Burns rejected it. Only unconditional surrender would do. As the Japanese War Cabinet argued amongst itself, Soviet troops continued to tear into Mongolia. At the same time, American fighters now roamed freely over Japan, shooting up military targets and transport links at will. Massive air raids continued to devastate Japan. Then, on August the 14th, the Truman administration sent word that the Emperor's position would be safeguarded, provided he agreed to accept the orders of the Supreme Commander of Allied forces. Hirohito used his huge prestige to instruct the War Cabinet to endure the unendurable and accept the terms. That day in Washington, President Truman announced that Japan had surrendered unconditionally.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Cheering, singing crowds erupted onto the streets of every American city. In Britain, it was midnight when the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, broadcast the news.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low. Peace has once again come to the world. Let us thank God for this great deliverance and his mercies. Long live the King.
Within minutes, crowds appeared on the streets of London. Many gathered outside Buckingham Palace. A giant street party lasted well into the following day. The next morning, August the 15th, an astounded Japanese people listened to the voice of their God Emperor for the very first time. He told them that Japan's position had become impossible, and the country was obliged to surrender. All military forces must lay down their arms. Such was the Emperor's prestige that almost every unit obeyed. But in Manchuria, despite the Japanese ceasefire, the Soviet forces fought on. For the first time, large numbers of Japanese troops now surrendered. Nevertheless, the Soviets, determined to seize as much territory as possible, continued to advance. Stalin wouldn't stop the fighting for another week. By then, the whole of Manchuria, half of Korea, and part of northern China were under his control. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and on many of the Pacific islands bypassed by the Americans, It took weeks for news of the surrender to reach isolated Japanese garrisons. Some Japanese soldiers would remain hidden in the jungle for more than 30 years. Finally, on August the 28th, 2 weeks after the surrender, the first US troops arrived in Japan. A huge US fleet gathered in Tokyo Bay, sailing past the shattered hulks of the once proud Japanese Navy that they had so comprehensively defeated. Several days later, on September the 2nd, 1945, a Japanese delegation came aboard the USS battleship Missouri. On its quarterdeck, the new Japanese Foreign Minister, Mamoru Shigemitsu, signed the document of unconditional surrender. It was countersigned by US General Douglas MacArthur, the man who would effectively run Japan for the next 6 years.
As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance.
Then a force of more than 2,000 Allied aircraft roared overhead. It was a fitting tribute to the overwhelming power which had finally brought Germany and Japan to utter defeat. World War II was at an end. Japan's ruthless desire to wage war had been crushed by a weapon of awesome destructive power. Now, in the East as in the West, the world would be divided and shared along new lines. New allegiances would be formed, and new enemies would vie for global influence under the specter of nuclear war. A new era in world history had begun.